We could begin the housekeeping comments, please.
Thank you for participating in today's meeting. Please do not connect to Zoom or teleconference while in the room, and please silence all devices. Click on the globe at the bottom of your screen to select either English or Spanish. Public comment will be taken after each item. If you are in the auditorium and wish to comment, please use the iPads located in the lobby. For meetings in other locations, please complete a blue speaker card and provide it to a South Coast AQMD employee. Speakers may be limited to a total of 3 minutes or less for all agenda items, and times may be shortened to ensure all speakers can be heard. A countdown timer will be displayed on the screen for each public comment. Word time will be allotted for Spanish translation that is not simultaneous. For questions or issues on public comment, please call the public advisor at 909-396-3247. That's 909-396-3247. Please adhere to the speaker time limit and treat others with courtesy, civility, and respect. Failure to do so can result in your mic being muted or you being removed from the meeting. Be aware that this meeting is being recorded. By participating, you are authorizing recording of audio and visual content presented during the live event and consent to subsequent use of the recording in the public domain by South Coast AQMD.
Thank you. I'd like to call to order the Stationary Source Committee for month of April and ask for roll call.
Councilmember Cacchiotti.
Here.
Senator Delgado.
Here.
Supervisor Mitchell.
Present.
Board Member Padilla-Campos, absent. Mayor Solache.
Present.
And Chair McCallum.
Here.
We have a quorum.
I feel so lonesome here by myself. Everyone else is out in video land. Anyway, let's go on to our first item is an update on the proposed amended rule 1146.2 be presented by Michael Kraus, our Assistant Deputy Executive Officer. Michael.
Great. Thank you, Mayor. Appreciate that. Sorry, Heather couldn't join us this morning, so I'll be doing the press. All right, so we're going to be talking about our proposed amendments to our Rule 1146.2. This is the rule that is regulating the nitrogen oxide emissions from what we call the large water heaters and small boiler heaters and process heaters. To put it in context, these are ones under 2 million BTU, typically found in commercial settings. However, this rule is unique and that there's a little bit of overlap because of the sizes of those units. They could affect some units that are located at residential facilities. Okay, next slide, please. So by way of background, again, this is established for these types of units. I want to highlight that these are unpermitted units. That's as such, then they are typically regulated through what we call like the supply chain. So your manufacturers, distributors, installers, what have you. This was a part of a control measure in our latest 2022 AQMP, which is striving for the most maximum emission reductions for those types of technologies that are out there that are technologically feasible and of course cost effective. With regards to our rule update, we did provide an update to this committee back in March. However, there were a number of comments that were made, and we got a direction from the committee to go ahead and explore some more of those comments to see how we can respond to them, as well as giving an update to today's committee meeting. Next slide, please. So in the interim, we have met with a number of the facilities that were raising some concerns or needing a better understanding of the rule, how it works, how it's going to impact them. So as you can see here in this timeline, there's a number of groups that we've met with, whether they were the Cleaners Association or we did some site visits. We met with the Restaurant Association, and there was a whole group of folks that represent those that are in the building trade. So office buildings, multi-apartments, et cetera, as you see there, including BizFed. And as we just recently did site visit as of soon as yesterday or 2 days ago. Okay, next slide, please. All right, just kind of give a brief overview then of the rule and its impact. So to put this in context to the nitrogen oxide emissions from all of our stationary sources, we created this pie over here on the right. And as you can see, when it comes to the nitrogen oxide emissions, a lot of those do come from our large combustion that we're familiar with. But there's also ones that come from our residential and commercial facilities. And in the green slice, sort of, we just want to pull out what we're talking about when it comes to this specific rule. As you can see, it's a decent size. With regards to the amendments that we're proposing, it will seek to achieve 5.6 tons per day reduction in the life and the full implementation of our rule proposals. And another highlight I just wanted to remind folks is this is involving a lot of units. Over 1 million units are impacted by this rule. And that's the case currently. This is not really due to our proposal. It's just the way it is. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, with regards to our proposal, again, we've sort of highlighted these at the last committee meeting, but just those folks that might have missed, we are overarchingly requiring a zero emission goal, a zero emission technology. But this is set up through future effective dates, which we'll get into in a moment. But the most important thing is that we're sending a market signal and a direction and a pathway for both those manufacturers, installers, and what have you to follow. On the staff side, we did a full BART analysis, so best available control, retrofit control technology assessment that involved looking at all sorts of different types of zero emission technologies that are out there, that are technologically feasible, and again, as well as cost effectiveness. There was a category that was not cost effective, and we reflected that when we designed the implementation scheduling for folks coming into compliance. So again, the second point here is about generating those effective dates based on the information that we had. In general, smaller units were more commercially available. They're already currently being installed in a number of locations. However, and then in addition to that, there's building codes that are coming into play, which will establish already a requirement for them for some of those newer buildings to install those zero emission technologies. But we wanted to also recognize the fact that some of them some of the technology, while technology is feasible, it is not maybe readily available or not in all applications. So we wanted to recognize that and again, sort of set them on a schedule as we see that technology continue to mature. And in addition, we recognize the fact that it's important to not only sort of set that market signal, but also to come in and revisit the requirements at a future date here to look at basically a technology check-in, and we'll get to that in a second. Next slide, please.
Michael, what are type 1 high temperature units?
Right. So the way there's what they call the type 1 and type 2s. The type 1 units tend to be the more higher temperature type units, like in the case of the dry cleaners we were talking about, where they're needing to do steam generation and what have you. Those are the ones that we recognize that there's more challenges. And so we've set longer implementation times for those units. Okay, overarching when it comes to the implementation, I just want to kind of break it down into how the rules sort of laid out. So first thing, again, recognizing that there will be buildings that are just brand new constructed buildings. And again, there are going to be building codes and things like that out there. But as far as our rule is concerned, we do want those newly installed units to happen at some point at an appropriate effective date that those will happen. And again, aligning up with building codes. The second one is about existing. So this gets a little more trickier. And the way we designed the rule is based on a sort of a two-tier process. So one would be an effective date. So after that date, if you were installing new equipment, that equipment would be then zero emission. But we had a second trigger, which is the age of the equipment. We wanted to recognize that there's going to be some stranded assets. If someone had just installed something a year or two, whatever, before the effective date, we wanted to make sure they were allowed to continue to utilize that equipment for what we called the unit age of that equipment. So it's a two triggers that occur. As far as those unit ages are concerned, we went out and we discussed with the vendors, the manufacturers, et cetera, to establish those dates. It's to give you a sense of that. It's about 15 years for those smaller heaters and pool heaters and things like that, and 25 years for other ones. So again, we've established sort of a two-tier process by which that happens. So even though there's an effective date, if again, your unit's hasn't reached that age, it can still, be operated until it reaches that point. When it comes to the final area, it's focused on existing residential buildings. So in this case, we didn't apply the two-tier. Instead, we just have an effective date, and they're not subject to the age of the unit. And therefore, it allows residents in those cases, let's say like a pool heater, to go ahead and utilize that equipment until its natural replacement. And just so you know, when it comes to enforcing that, we do that similar to what we do on our existing rules, 1111, 1121, as well as this one, we do it through the supply chain. Again, we enforce through the manufacturer, distributor, retailer, and installer. Next slide, please. Okay, this is another way of sort of breaking down how that compliance schedule will look like. I want to highlight a couple things here. So first off, there are the building codes that are coming into play beginning of January 2026. So we aligned the building code for those new buildings for the smaller units at that point in time. And then we sort of set the stage for our compliance schedule, as you can see, for the existing or all other buildings, as well as new buildings for the larger units or even the high temperature ones that you highlighted. But point I wanted to make here is, as you can see, we're fed in this technology assessment or technology check-in. So we'll be looking at technology, cost, what the utility rates at that point are looking like at a future date before the year 2028. So we'll have an idea at that point that we're on the right track. And then if there's any necessary adjustments to the rule, we can make them at that point. Next slide, please. Okay, I just wanted to highlight something we mentioned at the last committee meeting. I think that was raised about what are we talking about when we're talking about alternative compliance options. So we wanted to highlight some of those here for folks. And basically the idea is that when the stakeholders are raising certain concerns, challenges, potential hiccups, et cetera, in getting and complying with the rule and the rule schedule, we wanted to take those into consideration. So we wanted to add some additional time and considerations to some of these situations. For example, what if the utility isn't ready and is not complete with their upgrades? More time is necessary. We wanted to make sure the rule allows for that. Multiple units. Some facilities out there have a number of these units, and having potentially a compliance date that may run into at the same point in time is going to be really challenging for them. So we worked out with stakeholders an alternative schedule so those with multi-units can comply in a timely manner. Another issue was emergency replacement. As we all know and probably have experienced, there's the times where we just didn't plan to have our heater or boiler, what have you, break down, but it does happen. And in those cases, we recognize the fact that since there's going to be potentially for some a dramatic change going from this natural gas unit to electric, that there's elements that need to be achieved and taken care of. So we have conditions and provisions to address that, to allow for like temporary uses of those natural gas units until they can get up to speed. And so allowing for that, because clearly we don't want anyone, not having hot water or, whatever they use it for. Also mobile homes as well. So we've went out to a number of mobile homes, recognizing it's a little different than a regular, let's say, single family house and some of those conditions. So we put some conditions in considerations as well for them. And then finally, low use or low emitting unit exemptions, recognizing that some aren't used very often and are low emitting, and those can be provided an exemption from the going to zero. Next slide, please. Okay, so since the last committee meeting, there were some other additional issues that were raised, and again, we wanted to address those, and this is our response to some of those. One of them was the idea that some of these commercial operations are in buildings that they don't own. So there's a tenant that owns that building. Now, while the tenant is responsible, within the rule, it's going to put some pressure potentially on that business in ensuring that they are also in compliance when they don't have much control. So in this case, we've again extended some more additional time for that tenant to kind of figure out and how they're not only going to get maybe one of those string of operations they may own and operate to get up to speed and to comply, again to give that necessary time for make that happen successfully. The other issue was about small businesses. And we recognize that, there are more challenges for small business. They don't have as high of a budget. They don't particularly have a whole crew and time and things like that to work on things that are necessary, like design and engineering issues. So what we wanted to do there was provide the small businesses the same allowance that we do for the residential. So we would not have them held to a fixed unit age to make that replacement. They could do that at a natural replacement. This gives those small businesses time when they know they're eventually going to replace, that heater or boiler as they're already planning, and they would have done it anyway as that equipment ages, whether it was natural gas or electric, heat pump, let's say, to give them that time to prepare that budget, to prepare that designs that's needed if there's any space constraints, et cetera, to make that happen successfully. So they wouldn't be held to that. Now, they would still be held to an effective date that's out in the future. And in a lot of those cases, like we noted with the type 1, high temperature units, et cetera, to have the longest implementation time provided. And then finally, there was an issue that was raised at the last committee meeting. You might have heard folks talking about reclaimed facilities and being held to a certain provision. Put that in different contexts, we recognize that there are some facilities, particularly reclaimed facilities, that weren't held because they were under the reclaim program to a specific NOx limit. In particular, a NOx limit that's meeting the current NOx limit that's in this rule. So as this is a landing rule for those facilities, we recognize there's a challenge for them trying to do an interim in meeting that NOx limit, and then also going on the pathway to zero. So one of the suggestions the stakeholder had, and staff went back and assessed this, was basically get us on a track to go straight to zero. right? And so we went ahead and did some calculations as far as those different pathway options. Like if we had, gotten the facility to an interim limit on their way to zero or going straight to zero, it was actually lower emissions, allowing those folks to just go straight to zero and not hold them to an interim limit that would that evidently is burdensome for them. Okay, next slide, please. So as we met with the different groups and the different associations, we did want to sort of highlight the concerns that the dry cleaners had. And these are valid concerns. Again, the cost burden to small businesses, this idea of having a fixed unit replacement age, and then installations under leases. So I think as you notice, I've highlighted a number of these, so I just want to kind of go back through, but to remind folks that, first off, for these types of equipment, we are putting the longest implementation date out to 2033. And again, that's just the effective date. Doesn't necessarily mean it has to be replaced at that point. It is onto if you were a small business, it would be on that, the natural replacement. There's also the technology check-in, and this will give us an opportunity to kind of see the progress that's being made with those types of technologies and to see if there's any sort of revisiting of the requirements. Again, small businesses, replacing those not being held to that fixed unit age by natural replacement. Again, we have different alternative options. We highlighted one here when it comes to emergency replacement. We did hear that. Again, we created provisions for that to allow for more time. And then finally, a lot of the number of these facilities, not just from dry cleaners, but other small businesses will have the opportunity, if they're low use, to be provided the exemption. And I want to put a little footnote here. We are working on our future rebate program, and we are considering some options there for small businesses to take advantage of a rebate program. Okay, next slide, please. All right, the socioeconomic impacts. So just want to kind of touch on, again, this is a control measure under the AQMD, and a number of the equipment categories where, as we noted here, some of them have cost savings all the way up to a cost impact, but all under the NOx cost threshold in our plan. We do recognize, however, again, the high temperature units were not cost effective, but in considering those, we wanted to make sure that we provided the longest implementation time. Again, they'd be subject to a technology check-in. We do expect, as we've seen in other cases, whereas the technology matures and the industry becomes more competitive, those costs do go down. But overall, as we noted here at the bottom, this is a costly rule. Depending upon the interest rates you put on there, the socioeconomic assessments coming out to about 49 to 97. Those are annual numbers. We do want to highlight that we recognize, as folks have raised before, the high cost in the upgrades, those electric upgrades. We know that is a challenge, and that's an issue. We do believe it can be accomplished. It will take time. But that is about 40%. Again, there's units in the residential buildings, and we're being sensitive to those. And again, taking away that fixed age, I think, will be very helpful for them, so they can continue doing what they do and make those replacements appropriately and comply with the rule. When it comes to the job impacts, this is one that will, because of this high cost, it translates then into those opportunities or foregone opportunities for new jobs in the future at about 1,000. But again, I just want to footnote here that we are dealing with about 1 million units, and overall the proposal would provide a 5.6 tons per day reduction in nitrogen oxide emissions. Next slide, please. So I believe this is the conclusion that we're going to be releasing our 30-day documents in early May for a public hearing in June. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Michael, for the presentation. As you know, my concerns about technology being available for the dry cleaners, the high temperature. I'm very concerned that it's obviously not available now. And the major supplier to dry cleaners for boilers, Parker, is not even considering going into this space, is my understanding. So obviously heat pumps, small heat pumps aren't going to provide the steam that's required for dry cleaners. So I'm encouraged by the technology assessment in there to look at the current technology at the time. But it still bothers me. I also mentioned the footprint available in dry cleaners, for instance. They have a boiler room that is certain size, and if the technology requires a more footprint, that is a real problem. Also, I noticed you have addressed my concern about the tenants. Most dry cleaners are tenants in shopping centers. And if electrical upgrades are required, that's really the landlord's responsibility. And if that gets to be too much, they could just say, well, goodbye. We don't want you anymore. And that is a real concern. From my experience, dry cleaners pay the highest rent in any shopping center because it's easy for the landlord to do that, because once you get a dry cleaner in place, you can't readily move it, right? So the rent just keeps going up. Other comments from committee members?
Chair, I just wanted to echo your statements that I'm pleased to see that we're continuing to work on this. And I know this is a long-term measure, so I hope that we have a chance to continue to review it as technology improves. Thank you.
Very good. Supervisor Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to acknowledge the work the staff has done to really attempt to meet the industry needs. I appreciate the small business accommodations that have been made. And I'm looking forward to us moving forward with the rule. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Supervisor. Vice Chair Cacciati. You're muted.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I concur with all the comments by committee members, and I was just curious with Mike, if you can describe, I think it was on maybe slide 6, you talked about enforcement. How would that be? You mentioned manufacturers, distributors, installers. Can you just describe how we do that? I'm just curious.
Sure, no problem. So, of course, when it comes to the manufacturers out there, the one like, for example, the mayor had mentioned, Parker Boiler, as well as other groups, they make a whole mess of different types of suite of types of equipment, and some of them have moved into like the world of like heat pumps, electric boilers, and what have you. So those are available out there. The idea then is because we recognize there's some like transition, we will have some labeling requirements on some of those units that are being distributed to identify when then that this can be sold for this cannot be sold, let's say, for an existing building versus a new, and that what have you. So that's another way of kind of reminding folks of what they're applicable to. But that is exactly what the enforcement team does. They go out and they follow through with those to make sure that those are proper distributions, being properly distributed and then thus installed.
Is that similar to what we did years ago? Remember on the paints, Mike, where the low lead and stuff like that, and I guess you had to go out of their current inventory, and sometimes we go in and some of the large companies still had the old paint they were selling, which they weren't supposed to under our rules. Is that kind of similar?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Like I said, the technology assessment is very important for this rule. It'll be enforced through the providers, the manufacturers. No permits required by businesses or residential units. So, okay. If there are no further comments by committee members, I'll ask for public comment. If you have anyone in the audience wishes to speak, or those online, go ahead.
Yes, Chair, we have one speaker in the audience and multiple online. We'll start within the room. Peter Winningham.
Good morning, Peter.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and committee members. Thank you. Peter Whittingham, appearing today on behalf of a coalition of commercial and residential property owners and trade associations. We appreciate Michael, Heather, and their team's continued efforts to address the many significant concerns regarding this rule, including those revisions referenced in the staff presentation that have been included since last month's committee meeting. As staff has highlighted, this will be the most expensive rule ever to come before the governing board, with a total annual average cost of $49 to $97 million per the staff report, at an estimate of as much as $264,000 per ton of NOx. Unfortunately, as shared previously, we continue to have substantial concerns regarding the district's cost effectiveness report. A comprehensive analysis of commercial buildings is near completion, and we will very shortly be able to provide this report to the district. This analysis found that while high-rise buildings are less expensive to convert than two-story campus-style buildings, what that means is that high-rise conversions ran roughly 5 times more expensive than the district's estimates, while the cost to retrofit campus-style buildings ran 10 times the estimates. As an example, the cost to retrofit one such campus here in the district jurisdiction per the AQMD estimate is $1.5 to $2 million per ton. Our analysis found that the total cost would be roughly $15 million per ton. As part of this analysis, we've met with the manufacturer of package units, and the equipment alone for the building I just referenced would cost $750,000 apiece, 10 times the AQMD estimate of $75,000 installed. I'd like to briefly share 3 slides, the first of which shows an existing 1 million BTU gas boiler with relevant details shown there. Not sure if we have that. I'm not sure if you're able to see that, but again, that's an existing boiler, and both the weight and the cost, as well as the skid size, are shown there. And I will provide these slides to the staff for dissemination. The second slide shows the size, weight, and cost of an electric replacement. So you can see the skid is nearly 3 times as large. The weight is 10 tons as opposed to 773 pounds, and the cost obviously is extremely substantial. Finally, here, the third slide is a side-by-side comparison of these units. So again, some pretty significant deltas here. The delta here, frankly, is $30.85 per square foot versus the district estimate of $2.92 per square foot. As I've shared, this information is related to commercial buildings. Efforts are currently underway with licensed engineers to calculate the potential delta between the district estimates and current true costs, and this information will be available by mid-June for residential. At this point, we'd encourage the district to pause to conduct site visits of various types of commercial and multifamily residential buildings. We don't believe the second and third layer impacts of these proposed retrofits are being considered, and we feel the district will gain a much greater understanding during such visits. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Next, we'll go online. We'll close the queue for online comments and limit it each one to 2 minutes.
All right. Our first commenter online is Michael Shader.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
No, I can't.
Do I need to speak louder? Does that help?
Well, I don't know where the problem is, but no.
Well, I'm very sorry. I'm trying to figure this out.
I'm sorry we can't hear you.
We can hear him online, Chair. That's why I thought you were kidding, but
You can or cannot hear me?
I can
Sorry.
hear online too.
That's me. We can hear him a little bit.
Go ahead. But speak loudly.
My name is Michael Shader, the owner of Milton Eady Dry Cleaners located in Burbank. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm yelling at you. I don't mean to. Our family has been in the dry cleaning industry for over 70 years, 36 years in this location with close to 100 employees. My family has always been environmentally conscious and agrees we all must work together to do whatever we can to save our planet, but with efforts that allow small businesses like mine to stay in business. I believe Mr. Kraus and his staff have worked hard and done a good job presenting the information, but I would still appreciate hearing my thoughts. Clearly, we all have extremely difficult issues to resolve as a small business. With respect, my business and industry has continued to receive direct hits, which make it extremely difficult to maintain our operation in California. We want to continue to do whatever it takes to survive. It's my understanding South Coast has been working on this initiative for over a year, but unfortunately, my industry at large was not made aware of it until recently. A few dry cleaners did have a chance to meet with the AQMD staff, and then just a couple of days ago visit my plant. And I do welcome any of the board members to visit my location if you so desire. There are essentially no amendments I am requesting at this time, just that AQMD continue to do their due diligence before any legislation is adopted. I believe it's important that there is a greater understanding of the net effect it will have, therefore suggest more site visits. In my case, I urgently met with a large commercial electrical contractor in the city of Burbank. City of Burbank informed me they rely on natural gas and coal to supply us with our electricity, with the intention of utilizing green hydrogen. So it appears they have.
Thank you very much. Time has run out. We'll go on to the next speaker.
Next commenter is Adrian Martinez.
Good morning, Chair McCallum and members of the committee. My name is Adrian Martinez, and I'm here on behalf of Earth Justice. I'm testifying to support moving forward with this regulation to the board, and hopefully we can get it finalized and adopted in June. First, I want to thank you, Chair McCallum, for raising the importance of the technology check-in. I think that's going to be a really important check-in for this agency. And I also think it's an exciting opportunity. This regulation is sending an important signal to clean manufacturing that we need these zero emissions equipment in our region. This is a very important regulation, as this would be the largest emission reducing regulation that this agency has adopted since it took action on Rule 1109.1 in 2021. With more than 5 tons per day of NOx reductions, once the regulation is fully implemented, this is a critical part of the last air plan that this board adopted in late 2022. We're excited to get this regulation over the finish line and also work with the agency and all stakeholders to figure out how can we make this rule a success. We want to see the investments in all the companies covered under this rule, including the smaller businesses. And we want to work with all stakeholders to make sure we can get them the resources they need to make this rule a success. We look forward to seeing this item at the June board meeting and supporting it moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian, for your comments. Next.
Next commenter is Jed Holtzman. Jed, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair McCallum and committee members, and thank you to staff. Jed Holtzman from RMI, also known as the Rocky Mountain Institute, in strong support of governing board adoption of this rule at your next meeting. I wanted to note from staff slide 7 that even starting on this pace to decarbonize this sector means that we will have fossil fuel units operating after 2050, well after when the state is supposed to be net zero with respect to greenhouse gases and fossil fuel combustion. So really applaud staff for moving forward with this without further delay. And we definitely need to get started on the market transformation and further complementary policy development that will be required to make sure that this is done in a way we are all happy with. Slides 8 and 9 present various exemptions and accommodations that have been made based on industry concerns. Some of these concerns after all of the several working group meetings and workshops on this rule had taken place. And whether these provisions end up being common sense flexibility on the way to full compliance or loopholes that are abused or taken advantage of will wholly rely on the Air District's compliance and enforcement activities. So please take care of them in the budget. Wanted to point out there have been additional accommodations for regulated entities that are not presented here, most prominently on the proposed regulatory timelines. Lastly, glad to see you are proposing a future rebate program to help small businesses make this transition, as you are moving forward to do for residents of the Air District. As you are doing with the residential rebate program, we trust you will prioritize businesses in disadvantaged communities and communities overburdened by pollution. Thank you again for all of your work.
Thank you very much. Next.
Next commenter is Sarah Wiltfong. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you. This is Sarah Wiltfong with the Los Angeles County Business Federation. We represent about 240 business organizations, representing about 420,000 employers here in Los Angeles County. Really appreciate the staff presentation today. If the only comments that I could add is I would really encourage staff to do more site visits with a variety of different industries. And at BizFed, we're happy to connect staff with those industries. We're coming across more and more businesses, in particular our small business members, who are not aware that this rule is coming up. And considering the implementation deadlines, we see no need that the rule needs to be adopted in June. It could definitely be pushed back a little bit further to accommodate more industries being looked at and being examined, so that staff and the board can have an understanding as to the full impact that this rule could potentially have. Really appreciate Peter Whittingham's comments as well. We fully agree. But right now we ask that more site visits be done and more industries be considered before the rule is moving forward. And like I said, happy to accommodate and help connect staff with those industries. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Next.
Next commenter is Sasan Rahimzadeh.
Yes, thank you so very much, Chair and staff. We truly do appreciate it. I am Sasan Rahimzadeh from ARIA Cleaners, a member of the California Cleaners Association as well. And as we have gone through these last couple of months, meeting with staff, regardless, we truly appreciate all of their effort. However, to your points, Chair, which you mentioned earlier, we find that there's certain parts of this, the costs are not just the implementation of the equipment. Bringing in the infrastructure at times can be insurmountable. And being a tenant, again, to your point, which is very, very, very critical, and I think it really needs to be looked at quite a bit more, is that when our leases come up to renewal, exactly what you mentioned, Chair, is that the landlord will have every right and frankly, legitimate right to say, well, you know what, I just simply don't want to renew this lease anymore because it's going to be very impactful on the rest of my property. So it is a huge point. We truly appreciate the 2028 reassessment schedule because we really feel that is needed. But at the same time, simply giving it more time doesn't, I don't believe it will fix all of the issues. Time alone will not fix the fact that the shopping centers will require massive infrastructure upgrades, which would, they'll have every right to refuse the renewal of those leases. So, which is the only way we can remain to be in business. So we appreciate you looking at these topics substantially more. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your comments. Next.
Next commenter is Blake Perez.
Right. Thank you. Good morning, Honorable Chair, committee members. Thank you. My name is Blake Perez. I'm with the Building Owners and Managers Association of Greater Los Angeles. We represent 135 million square feet of office and retail space throughout Greater LA. We appreciate the effort given by staff to work with stakeholders and also really including that technology review as part of the considerations for this rule change. But we still have serious concerns about the costs this rule would trigger. Many of our members are still recovering from the impacts of COVID and the change in the way people work. Retrofitting a commercial building is a capital intensive project, and simply put, the industry has a difficult time accessing capital right now, and that's likely to remain the case as vacancies continue to remain stubbornly high. Additionally, we're seeing construction and labor costs continue to rise, and as was shown by Peter Whittingham's slide, these systems and these new technologies do require a different footprint within a building, and it's a lot more complicated than just switching out an appliance. A lot more work has to go in on the other side, as well as the way these systems work within high rises within these campuses. We would really encourage that, as you explore alternative compliance options, you do make considerations for the use of hydrogen. We have seen, across the country that hydrogen can, under the right conditions, work in the same way as natural gas and be able to be a substitute fuel with near zero or zero emissions. And being able to do that and keep the appliances that are currently in place would actually be helpful for our members to be able to achieve. Many of them have the same goals of energy efficiency, zero emissions, but they don't necessarily need to move to all electric, which would trigger a lot of these costs and these expenses that really our industry is not in a position to invest in. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. And our last commenter is
Chris Chavez. Chris,
Yeah,
go ahead.
good morning, Chair and board members. This is Chris Chavez, Deputy Policy Director at Coalition for Clean Air. Just wanted to echo the comments of other environmental justice organizations. We support the adoption of Rule 1146.2, and I would emphasize expedient adoption of this rule as it already is. This rule has been delayed. It was initially scheduled for September 2023. So, having this rule come up to the committee and the board sooner than later is important. And really want to connect this to the district's own plan, and it's a 2022 air quality management plan, which very correctly elevated building decarbonization as being a major priority for its air quality attainment goals. As we know, the district is in extreme non-attainment for smog, and getting rid of sources, cleaning up sources of NOx pollution is key in making sure that we reduce that smog. And we know that the federal government is increasingly looking at South Coast's non-attainment status, and potential for action and intervention at the federal level. And ultimately, this means that cleaner air is obviously a healthier Southern Californians, particularly in communities that have disproportionate environmental impacts. I also want to agree with Jed Holtzman's comments about really directing and prioritizing low-income and disadvantaged communities for those incentive dollars, and making sure that they are receiving the direct benefits from those climate investments. So thank you very much for your time, and look forward to continuing to engage in this process.
Thank you, Chris, for your comments. That concludes our public comment on this item. Any committee members have additional comments? Seeing none, I would like to have this brought back to our May committee meeting to address. Would like you to address some of the issues raised by Peter Whittingham, and also take BizFed up on additional site visits that they might facilitate for you, and bring it back to our next committee meeting in May.
We will do so.
Thank you very much. We'll go on to item number 2, which is an update on proposed amended Rule 463 organic liquid storage, presented by Michael Morris, our Planning and Rules Manager. Michael, another Michael.
Good morning, Chair McCallum and committee members. Next slide, please. So I'll be discussing our amendments to Rule 463. That's a rule that regulates VOC emissions from storage tanks. You may recall from last year that we amended a similar rule, Rule 1178, that regulated VOC emissions from larger storage tanks at petroleum refineries. This effort to amend Rule 463 completes our efforts to regulate fugitive emissions from storage tanks as requested through several community emission reduction plans in AB 617. I'll be talking about the leak detection that we're going to be including in the rule as well as some of the control requirements. And in addition, I'll be touching on the contingency measure that we're including in the rule. Next slide, please. So our main objective in Rule 463 was to add in optical gas imaging. This is a leak detection technology that is available now to more easily and cost effectively find leaks. Right now, the process is to look for leaks every 6 months through a more manually intensive process. With the OGI cameras, we can look at a broad field very quickly. And that allows us, instead of every 6 months, we're going to be doing emission checks every 2 weeks to more readily and quickly capture these leaks and address those leaks through repair. Additionally, one of the requirements in the rule is to dome tanks that have a true vapor pressure greater than 3.0. The domes prevent a wind effect that would otherwise result in fugitive emissions. It's not necessarily vapor tight, but it does dramatically improve the fugitive emissions that come from external floating roof tanks. Next slide, please. So in addition to those two requirements, we will be requiring that the seals be improved on these floating tanks, as well as increased emission control for the vapor recovery units that work on fixed roof tanks. And there are additional requirements for reporting, record keeping, and testing. Next slide, please. So the cost effectiveness is presented here in this graph. As you can see, the cost effectiveness for these are below our VOC threshold. I will point out that we have been in discussions this week with some of our stakeholders about some of the costs and emissions in here, but we do expect that they will remain cost effective for these applications. For the doming, the implementation date is when the tanks are next emptied, but no later than the next 23 years. And for the secondary seals, again, the same when they're next emptied or within 10 years. We have been in discussions also with the same stakeholders about the timeframes for the secondary seals.
Question.
Yes.
One is 10 years and the other is much longer. Don't you have to address them at the same time, the seals and the dome?
So not necessarily with the dome. What we understand is that there is cleaning and degassing necessary for the tanks that have the doming work performed on them. For the seals, we've understood from our conversations with manufacturers that you don't have to wait for that time period. And so now the conversations that we've had is that some of the tank owners and operators have come back to us and said, in fact, you do need to wait till that same. So that's kind of where we are looking at the time frame for that particular measure.
So it could change?
It's possible that it can change. We are checking with the vendors and manufacturers about that cleaning and degassing requirement.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this rule does have a contingency measure to address an AQMD issue for the Coachella Valley contingency measure. If triggered, and that would be triggered by either a failure to meet a milestone or failure to meet the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, that OGI frequency that we currently have in the rule at 2 weeks would be reduced for certain facilities down to every week. So it basically would double the frequency. This contingency measure does apply to Coachella Valley, but we are including that contingency measure for South Coast as well, in case that similar situation arises for another AQMD. Next slide, please. So we provided some preliminary look at the socioeconomic impacts from this rule. The graph on the left shows the distribution of the costs and the actual costs for these provisions. And the graphic on the right shows geographically where these costs would be coming from. There will be a draft socioeconomic assessment provided at the 30-day period, as typical for our rules. Next slide, please. Likewise, we will have a 30-day document for the draft environmental assessment. The current look at it shows that there's no significant environmental impacts. Next slide, please. So right now, we're not aware of any key issues. As I did mention, we are still in discussion about some of the details here, but we are proposing to have a public hearing in June. And that concludes my presentation.
Committee members, any comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll ask for public comment. Is there anybody in the public who wishes to speak on this item?
There are no commenters in the auditorium. We do have commenters online. First one is Connie Cunningham.
2 minutes, and I'll close the comment or the queue.
Hi, it's Connie Cunningham with Zenith Energy West Coast Terminals. I have a few comments regarding mostly the doming aspect of this rule. Staff has looked at it mostly from a much smaller tanks. We have larger tanks up to 299 feet in diameter, basically a football field. And it's
Sorry, you're breaking up.
significantly more expensive the wider you go as far as the
I'm sorry, you keep breaking up. We can't hear you,
it's
understand.
much more with the diameter. Hopefully you can hear me now.
Go ahead.
It's exponentially more expensive to dome much larger tanks, and that hasn't been considered in the staff report. Also, I noticed on slide 7, the cost per category for the OGIs, it's $2.3 million per year, but that's spread over about 90 companies, while the doming is $1.8 million per year, and that's probably spread about 5 or 6 companies because there aren't that many that need to dome per the requirements of the 3 PSI, et cetera. So that's significantly more, while the OGI is basically $25,000 per year per company. You're looking at over $350,000 per year per company. And that's all I'll say right now. Thanks.
Thank you for your comments. Staff, would you address the points that you made?
Certainly, excuse me. So yes, one of the things that did get brought up about looking at larger tanks, we are including that in our cost estimates and revising those as well. I think the other aspect of that is that those larger tanks have larger emissions. So but we will include that as part of our analysis to see that it remains cost effective.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Next commenter is Mark Abramowitz.
Go ahead, Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. This is Mark Abramowitz with Community Environmental Services. And when your board set some cost effectiveness guidelines, it wasn't a specific, there was a number, but after a control measure reached that number, there was a requirement in there to go ahead and reevaluate for possible inclusion in a rule. And for this rule, most of the reductions are coming from this monitoring requirement. But staff is only proposing a more stringent monitoring requirement if as a contingency measure. And to me, given that this requirement in a lower level gets most of your emission reductions for this rule, there is really no reason why the more frequent monitoring should not be included in the rule as part of the basic rule and not just as a contingency measure. note that these sources are mainly upwind of everybody in the basin, and number two, adjacent to or in EJ communities. So what kind of additional credit or consideration should EJ measures be given in looking at whether or not to include a particular provision in the rule? I frankly think that the board should adopt a rule which reflects the greatest ability to reduce emissions, and that's not what's being proposed here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That concludes our public comment. Any further comments from our committee members or questions? Seeing none, we'll go on to our next item, which is the proposed Rule 317.1 Clean Air Act non-attainment fees, presented by Dr. Chung, our Planning and Rules Manager.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair McCowan and members of the committee. My name is Kalam Chung, a Planning and Rules Manager. Next slide, please. This proposal addresses the federal Clean Air Act requirements that's included in Section 185 of the Act. It establishes fee requirements for ozone non-attainment area that is either classified as severe or extreme. This requirement kicks in when the US EPA issues a finding of failure to attain, and is applicable to major stationary sources of ozone precursors, namely VOCs and NOx. Note that this is not a discretionary action, because if a state or an air quality district does not implement Section 185 of the Act, the US EPA is required to step in to collect the fees and interest, and the fee will then go to the US Treasury. Next slide, please. There are two ways to comply with this requirement. The default pathway is fee collection, where we collect fees from major sources. The alternative pathway is a fee equivalency approach, but this pathway is only available when two conditions are met. The first condition is that it addresses a ozone standard that has been revoked. And the second condition is that there are emission reductions that are surplus to the state implementation plan. For the revoked 1979 1-hour ozone standard, both those two conditions have been met, and we've been implementing 185 requirements through Rule 317, which uses the fee equivalency approach. This proposal addresses two other ozone standards, namely the 1997 and 2008 8-hour ozone standards. For these two standards, the two conditions are not met, so we're proposing to use the fee collection as a compliance mechanism for these two standards. Next slide. So where are we in terms of attainment? Air quality has definitely improved a lot in the last few decades. However, as for the 1997 standard, which has an attainment deadline of June 2024, both the South Coast Air Basin as well as the Coachella Valley, they will not be able to attain by the deadline. But as you can see from the graph, the Coachella Valley is really close to attainment, so it's very likely that it could be eligible for an extension. Next slide. This slide shows the source contributions for VOCs and NOx. In order for our basin to attain the 8-hour ozone standards, we must reduce NOx. The pie chart on the right shows the contributions for NOx emissions, where over 80% of NOx emissions are from mobile sources. Next slide. This slide shows the key requirements for the proposal. Again, this rule only applies to major stationary sources of VOCs and NOx, which have emissions that are over 10 tons per year. It will impact about 320 facilities, and these facilities represent the top 1% of VOCs and NOx emitters in our basin. The fee will apply to emissions that exceed 80% of the baseline. The fee rate is about $12,000 per ton in 2023, and this fee rate is annually adjusted by the US EPA based on the Federal Consumer Price Index. The table on the right shows the timeline of how it works. The more immediate timeline is for the 1997 standard, where the attainment deadline is June of 2024, and that's also the year where the baseline emissions will be determined. Non-attainment fee might begin as early as 2025. Next slide, please. This is an example of how the fee will be determined. The bar in the orange shows the emissions in 2024, which is also used to determine the baseline emissions. The orange dotted line represents a level where it is 80% of the baseline. So fee will apply to emissions that are above the orange dotted line, and fee does not apply to emissions that are below the orange dotted line. For the bar in the middle, the blue bar in the middle, it represents emissions in 2025. And because there are 4 tons of emissions that are above the orange dotted line, those 4 tons will be assessed a fee, and the total obligation for that year will be about $48,000. If we look at the bar on the right, all the emissions are below the orange dotted line, so there will be no non-attainment fee for that year. Next slide. As you can tell from the example, the baseline emissions is really critical in terms of determining the non-attainment fee. There are facility operators that have expressed that their emissions in 2024 might not be representative of their normal operating conditions. So the rule does include an option to choose an alternative baseline provided that certain conditions are met. One of the conditions is that the US EPA issues a guidance document, which is consistent with the statutory requirement of the Clean Air Act. Next slide. This slide shows a preliminary analysis of the amount of fees to be collected. Fee obligation for the initial year 2025, is conservatively estimated to be about $26 million. These fees are anticipated to decrease over time as emissions decrease, primarily driven by the implementation of rules that reflect best available retrofit control technology. An example could be seen on the graph on the right. The implementation of Rule 1109.1 will reduce NOx emissions from refineries. In 2025, the initial fee obligation for NOx emissions will be about $8 million. But over time, as NOx emissions reduced, the fee obligation will be reduced dramatically to about $250,000 in 2032. That fee obligation may increase again in 2033 if the basin fails to attain the 2008 ozone standard. Next slide. This slide shows the type of facilities that will be paying into the non-attainment fee in 2025. Again, the fee obligation of $26 million is a very conservative higher end estimate. If these major sources, they're able to reduce their emissions by 20%, then no non-attainment fee will be collected. Next slide. It's estimated that about 80 jobs will be foregone annually on average based on the implementation of this rule. And a more detailed draft social economic impact assessment will be available 30 days prior to the public hearing, which is expected in early May. Next slide. In terms of the key remaining issues, we're not aware of any key remaining issues for the proposal. However, we received a lot of comments regarding how to properly use the fund. This proposal, it sets up the regulatory framework to implement Section 185, and the Clean Air Act does not specify how to use the fund. The usage, we're envisioning that it will be determined through a future public process, primarily because there are a lot of uncertainty in terms of how much we're going to collect. In addition, the non-attainment fee, although it might start as early as 2025, there will be time that is needed to report, also time needed for staff to determine the non-attainment fee obligations, invoicing, and the time for the facilities to pay the invoice. So we're envisioning that the earliest that we can collect the money will be about 2027. Next slide. This slide shows that this proposal has gone through a very robust public process. In addition to working group meetings and public consultation meetings, we've also had multiple meetings with affected businesses. In terms of next step, we're planning to have a set hearing in May with a public hearing in June. And I think that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chung. Any comments from committee members? Seeing none, I do have some comments. You know, as a city, if we tried to institute a fee like this, we couldn't do it because fees are meant to cover cost of accomplishing something. So in my mind, this is really a fine for not being able to meet the requirement of the Clean Air Act based on mobile sources not doing their job. And we're putting the onus on stationary sources to come up with this fine for something they're not responsible for. I understand it's in the law, it's in the Clean Air Act, but it's totally nonsensical to me that you would punish those who have been striving so hard to and putting forth all their effort to meet the requirement when the mobile sources haven't. That's my soapbox. The other aspect that was brought up was how are these funds to be used? I would hope that we would not use these funds to incentivize mobile sources, that we would use these funds somehow to benefit the stationary sources or the communities that are involved from the stationary sources. I don't know what that means, but that's my initial take on this. It would not be fair to take this money from stationary sources and put it against mobile sources, in my mind. Having said all that, we also have issues brought up by the Clean Water SoCal in their letter of March 29th. They raised some things that I think we should address. And probably someone on public comment will talk about that. I see Supervisor Mitchell, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hear you loud and clear in terms of your perspective of really kind of the appropriateness of it and whether it's a fine or fee. I get that. I guess my only concern is, as I understand it, if we don't implement it, then the EPA will. And we then have no control over how the fee/fine would be used. So that would be my only comment. Is my understanding that because we are in severe non-attainment, we don't have a choice. And so the real issue for us to decide is how the fees are used. I'm going to make sure staff that I'm understanding that correctly.
I agree. We have no choice in this matter. I was just on my soapbox.
Oh, okay. Fair enough. Fair enough. All right.
Other comments? Go ahead, Supervisor.
Nope. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other comments from committee members? Let's see what the public comments are. We have public comment in the House or not?
Yes, in-house, we have one comment, multiple online. We'll start in the auditorium. First,
We'll limit it to 2 minutes and I'll close the queue on the outside comments.
All right. First up, David Rothbart. Turn the microphone on.
Still can't, it's not on. Nope. Did the batteries run down?
Thank you. Good morning. I'm David Rothbart, and I work for the Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts, and I'm the Air Quality Committee Chair for Clean Water SoCal. Clean Water SoCal represents the wastewater sector in Southern California, and I'd like to quickly provide some comments on the proposed rule. As outlined in South Coast's recent letter to EPA regarding their proposed disapproval of your ozone SIP, it is not possible to achieve attainment without controlling mobile and federal sources. Despite EPA's failure to control the vast majority of emissions responsible for non-attainment, EPA requires a penalty to be imposed upon stationary sources, or the Title V facilities we're talking about. The irony of the situation is that South Coast could eliminate all stationary sources in the basin, and we'd still be unable to achieve attainment. As my members can attest, South Coast is the most restrictive air district in the United States. We are subject to best available control technology standards, and we cannot tell the public to stop flushing their toilets to avoid this penalty. We concur with the arguments in South Coast's letter to EPA and believe the same approach should be applied to Clean Air Act Section 185 penalties. In other words, EPA should do their fair share and reduce combustion emissions and clarify that Clean Air Act penalties under both sections 179 and 185 are not appropriate in this situation. As you'll hear from some of our members, the minimum request is that the proposed rule be modified to allow potential flexibility for essential public services. This would merely mimic what other air districts have already approved to implement Section 185 penalties. Thank you very much for your consideration.
Thank you for your comments. Next online.
Moving to online comments, first commenter is Steve Jepson. Go ahead, Steve.
Hello, Chair McCallan, Stationary Source Committee members, and South Coast AQMD staff. This is Steve Jepson, Executive Director for Clean Water SoCal. We represent 80 public water wastewater agencies in Southern California, and I support the comments from David Rothbart and my fellow wastewater colleagues. Many of our member agencies are in the South Coast AQMD area, and those with Title V permits would be impacted by this rule. Public wastewater facilities perform an essential public service, treating the public's wastewater 24/7 in all types of weather conditions. They protect public health and the environment in all types of communities. These facilities are under the South Coast AQMD Command and Control regulatory structure, the most stringent air quality regulations in the nation. The facilities are already required to operate with best available control technology backed and cannot reduce the amount of sewage to be treated or relocate to avoid this penalty. Imposing Section 185 fees on these public facilities is essentially fining the public for going to the bathroom and will not lead to less ozone-forming emissions. As a result, we believe that the public wastewater facilities should be treated differently. At a minimum, proposed Rule 317.1 should include flexibility similar to what San Joaquin Valley APCD included in their Rule 3171. Thank you for the opportunity to comment today.
Thank you for your comments. Next.
Next up is Allison Torres.
Good morning. My name is Allison Torres, and I work for Eastern Municipal Water District. We are a water, wastewater, and recycled water agency in Southwest Riverside County. We are an essential public service, and that will be subject to proposed Rule 317.1. As mentioned previously by other commenters, wastewater facilities have a unique challenge where we're unable to avoid non-attainment penalties by relocating or reducing flows to our facilities, and our facilities are equipped with back controls and subject to command and control rules. We do remain concerned that the current approach to proposed Rule 317.1 is inconsistent with similar rules adopted by other air districts. We've reviewed other air district rules, and other districts have flexibility language in their rules that proposed Rule 317.1 currently omits. We're not aware of EPA disapprovals for these other air district rules, and there's a process to address a disapproval if it does occur. We strongly encourage South Coast AQMD to include similar flexibility provisions in proposed Rule 317.1 where possible. For example, we suggest including a clean unit provision and language in the rule to address future EPA guidance regarding Section 185 fee implementation. Also, other air district rules have clarified that penalties are not cumulative upon the failure of multiple ozone standards. So we respectfully request this inconsistency to be addressed before adoption. EMWD is a member of Clean Water SoCal, and we support the written and verbal comments provided by Clean Water SoCal on this rule. Thank you for the opportunity to comment here today.
Thank you for your comments. Next.
Next is Rhonda Abushaban.
Hello, good morning. My name is Rhonda Abushban, and I'm with the Orange County Sanitation District. We operate 2 publicly owned Title V wastewater treatment facilities, serving roughly 2.6 million people in northern and central Orange County. OCSAN is an essential public service provider that is subject to command and control requirements and BAC standards. OCSAN is a member of the Clean Water SoCal, and we would like to underscore the comments presented by Clean Water SoCal and the member agencies in the wastewater sector. As was stated in the Clean Water SoCal March 29th comment letter, proposed Rule 317.1 will require major stationary sources like OCSAN and other publicly owned wastewater treatment facilities to pay for the region's inability to achieve attainment with the federal 8-hour ozone standards pursuant to Section 185 of the Clean Air Act. I believe we all agree that wastewater treatment facilities can neither be relocated or shut down. The regions and the communities we serve depend on our respective organizations to safely collect, treat, and recycle their wastewater. And as such, the proposed rule imposes a unique challenge on wastewater treatment facilities. As it currently stands, a key remaining unresolved issue we see in the proposed draft rule language is the lack of flexibility provisions we have seen adopted in similar rules by other air districts. So for example, San Joaquin Valley APCD Rule 3171 contains a clean emissions unit provision, and this provision provides an exemption for equipment as backed. At minimum, such a provision should be included in the proposed Rule 317.1 to provide some relief for essential public services at backed. While we understand EPA may reject such common sense provisions, we do encourage South Coast AQMD to provide the same flexibility as other air districts and work with the EPA to find methods to actually clean the air.
Thank you very much. Next.
Next is Rita Loof.
Good afternoon, Rita Loof, Director of Environmental Affairs for Radtech International, and we submitted public comments with our concerns regarding this rule. We urge the district to recognize the efforts of facilities who have voluntarily reduced their emissions. There should be an exemption for companies that have invested in clean technology early on. The baseline calculation may penalize operators who have been good environmental stewards. Presumably, the emissions from facilities that have implemented clean technology will be lower than those that have not done so. As an example, a facility who kept emissions at 15 tons per year will have a higher baseline than a facility who reduced those emissions from 15 to 10. So the 15-ton emitter will have more flexibility as far as the throughput at the facility. So a clarification on this is very much needed. During the public consultation meeting, permit holders expressed concern that they may have been advised by district staff to participate in the Title V program. One commenter stated that the emissions from his facilities were well below the Title V applicability threshold, but that permit engineers had encouraged the facility to stay in the Title V program. Since Rule 317.1 specifically targets Title V facilities, it is now even more important for facilities to avoid applicability. And there is no clear process on how facilities can petition the district if they want to get out of the Title V program. So we urge the district to explain the process in the staff report. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next,
Next commenter is Adrian Martinez.
and that will be the last commenter.
Good morning, or good afternoon, Chair McCallum and members of the committee. My name is Adrian Martinez, testifying today on behalf of Earth Justice. I wanted to address some of the comments that have taken place today. The first context I think is important to remind folks is that a lot of these facilities, would have been paying a fee under Rule 317, but for the equivalency approach that has been implemented in the region. And so really there's been a decade of kind of, no fee on any of these major stationary sources. And so I think it's important context here. There already is flexibility in the South Coast program. The second thing I really, just like, the representatives from BizFed were, articulating that, staff should, go do site visits for 1146.2. I think it's really important that the board and staff dig into the data on compliance for Rule 317. In a vacuum without that data, it's really important to understand that under this rule, the folks that would likely be paying the most are oil and gas companies, refineries, entities that are not at BACT. And so I think it's really important to dig into, how much would these essential public services pay, so we have a kind of crystal clear discussion of what we're talking about. I fear that the flexibilities being proposed here today, they're patently unlawful and will lead to a successful challenge rejecting Rule 317.1 if some of the ones that are being proposed today are implemented. We encourage you to just stay strong with staff's proposal. We think it makes the most sense and is the clearest compliance pathway for the Clean Air Act. Thank you.
Thank you. Wayne, you wish to comment on the comments?
I'm going to have Jason Aspel comment.
Yes, in regards to the Title V comment about whether a company or staff advises company to stay in Title V federal permitting or not, I was on that meeting and addressed the question. It is a business decision for a company if they wish to lower their permitted emissions to come out of the Title V program. So that is done on a case-by-case basis. Staff makes themselves available to answer questions, but we do leave that to the business to make that decision.
And Mayor, I think
on the public clean water issue.
I think you're addressing the point where there basically is a request for flexibility in terms of how these fees are assessed. And I can say we can certainly consider those. I don't believe that there has been anything raised that we haven't already thought of and or discussed. So I think that the path moving forward is fairly clear. There are other options which would probably be best discussed in closed session moving forward, because as you know, there's a number of things that are at play. And so I think how this impacts that could also tie into some of those other aspects as well.
And I don't disagree with you. I'm just concerned about the issue raised by the Clean Water SoCal.
I'm not prepared to address that presently, but we will
Okay.
certainly address it.
Oh, good. Then I would ask that we come back to this committee in May with addressing those issues.
Chair, if I
Go
might,
ahead. Go ahead, Vanessa.
I think I would like to discuss this in closed session. Wayne, I'll take that. I have just questions about this one, but I know there's little that we can discuss in public. So.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Chair, I think that we can go ahead and come back to committee next month.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comments from committee members? Seeing none, item 4, can we forego that? Committee members, anyone who would like to hear from item 4, or can we forego that in the interest of time?
Mr. Chair, I'm fine foregoing it if, and I don't know if procedurally this is appropriate. I just have a couple questions. If I could share them with staff, so when we hear it, they could be prepared to answer them. Can I do that, or should I just wait till next month?
Wait till next month, or you want to hear them now?
If we could hear it, it would be helpful for us to come back.
Supervisor.
Thank you. I wanted to just talk about and get clarification with regard to public notification for leaks. Want to just understand why we wouldn't require that. And if you could clarify what we're hearing that the community is requesting with respect to the neutralizing agents, and what staff is proposing to do instead. I know that the community is requesting that the neutralizing agents be not used. So I just want to get clear about staff's response to that.
Yeah, we'll definitely be able to respond when we bring this back to you, Supervisor, and the committee.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome. Next, we have 3 written reports before us. There are 4 written reports before us. Is there any need to look at any of those?
Sorry, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
We'd like to make a recommendation to the committee for consideration regarding item 6, and that's on the frequency of reporting. And if I could just ask Jason to explain.
Thank you, Wayne. Item 6 is the quarterly price report for reclaimed trading credits, or RTCs. Staff has been providing these reports for several years, and through the NOx shave, prices did peak and spike, but are now back down and stabilized. And staff has been reporting these to the board and received no comments. And considering there's no regulatory requirement for quarterly reporting, only annual reporting, staff is recommending to report these prices annually in the reclaim audit each year, with the understanding that if there are any sustained abnormalities in prices, we would bring that back to the board, but that is our recommendation.
Any objection to having that as an annual report? Seeing none, we'll do the annual report.
Thank you, Chair.
Going on to other matters, any other business we need to discuss?
Mr. Chair, the supervisor has her hand raised.
Supervisor, go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to, kind of acknowledge publicly under written report 8, the notice of violation penalty summary. I asked that my staff, give me the full list of penalties that have been levied in companies in the district I represent. And I just wanted to note that I was struck by the significant increase. I typically maybe have 2 or 3, but I've got well over a dozen this time. And it's just something I'm tracking and following on behalf of the constituents I represent, and what these penalties could, represent in terms of their quality of life in their community. So I just felt the need to acknowledge that publicly, that I'm tracking companies that are being penalized in the district, and may have follow-up conversation with staff about it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Supervisor. No other business. We'll go on and ask for general public comment for items not on the agenda, but under the purview of this committee. Is there anyone in the public who wishes to comment? Seeing none, we'll close the public comment, and our next meeting will be Friday, May 17th at 10:30 a.m. And with that, we're adjourned.
Great weekend, everybody.